Hello, and welcome to this sort of hopefully handy dandy 10 most helpful Beowulf resources for students and teachers video. And I just want to say these could be used for research projects. I would really strongly urge teachers of Beowulf, whether you know the poem well or not, to go through these. Get your library to buy some of these books. The online resources are easy to access, and you can listen to them while driving, cooking. You could take notes on them. This is something we don't often discuss, and maybe it's its own separate video. I think there's an inherent danger in someone like me just taking my college and grad school notes and just having that be the one time in my life where I've thought deeply about these texts, and I just sort of reinvent those over and over again. And once, with something like Beowulf or any great text, once you dip your toe into secondary material, I know there are a lot of thoughts about whether that's relevant and helpful. I just think, for me, the goal is for my students to fall in love with this stuff. And they're not going to fall in love with all of it, but I want to give it my best chance that they can at least sort of have an awe and an appreciation for some of the best works of literature. And I know that the way that's done most of the time is to be surrounded by people who've thought deeply about it, who love it too. And not all of us can have, J.R.R. Tolkien for class unless you were alive in the, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. But you can read his reflections on Beowulf, and you can see someone who just deeply loves and has thought deeply about this. So I just think it's really, really important. So these might be things you want to poke around. The other benefit, other than just inspiration, which is not a small thing for teachers, it's easy to just get an automatic pilot mode, right? Other than inspiration is scholarly resources, podcasts, lectures online they can enrich our understanding of these texts. Whether we mention all these sort of insights to students or not, it enriches us. And more often than not, it can create really interesting questions and writing prompts. So suddenly the universe, the possibilities pedagogically widen tremendously the more deeply we think about the primary works themselves, and listen to other people who've thought about them very deeply. So several of these are videos. Michael Wood, you might know from his In Search of Shakespeare series, which is really great. And then he has a little cottage industry set up. So he did In Search of Beowulf. YouTube video about 45, 50 minutes long. There's a reenactment of an Anglo-Saxon feast with Beowulf being recited. That's awesome. You get to see the Beowulf manuscript up close in the British Museum. That's awesome. And he just gives very easy to follow, like background information, historical, linguistic information. He tells great stories, great interviews. Really, really helpful for, I think, novices to the poem. But also, if you didn't have a lot of experience with medieval lit in college and you're teaching this, this is some good background. The In Our Time series has some great podcasts. It's BBC4. And there's a Beowulf one. And it's, again, on YouTube. And it's Laura Ashe, who's a medievalist at Oxford, Claire Lease, who's a medievalist at King's College, and then Andy Rawlinson, who's at Oxford. So these are some of the topics. The historicity. Everybody wants to know how historically accurate Beowulf is. To me, it's like one of the least interesting things, but that's because I'm a fiction nerd. So there's a lot of discussions about which characters do we know are real people, were real people, and which are invented. By the way, one of the sheerly invented ones is Beowulf. Really interesting chat about the magical role of objects. Really interesting chat about the story of the manuscript, the lack of linear plot, Beowulf's philosophical considerations, and the challenges to translating the poem. Just as a sidebar, I just want to say, particularly to teachers, I really, really encourage you to allow students, if you're doing research, to allow students to use legitimate podcasts and legitimate college lectures that are videoed. You have people from highly established universities who are medievalist. They just happen to be on YouTube. That's different than my neighbor who's just a really nice person who's read Beowulf once creating a podcast. It's like any article, right? You have to help the students figure out what is reputable and what isn't. But I just think these videos can be great resources. So this is kind of hokey. It's a History Channel documentary, The Clash of the Gods. There's an Odyssey one, an Iliad one, the epic legend of Beowulf. And it's sort of obsessed with trying to make this work of literature a piece of history as much as it can. Again, I have not much interest in that, but I think for like younger students or for students that, maybe a historical, I never know what's going to hook my students to a book. If it's the archaeology behind the Sutton Hoo burial and that's what opens the book up to them, great. If it's history, if it's linguistics, if it's battle strategy, look, who cares? As long as they enter the book thoughtfully, whatever way to get them there is great. Two of my favorite women on the planet are right here. Translating for a World on Fire. It's a podcast. Maria Headley, Emily Wilson, and also it's moderated by the woman who wrote Song of Achilles, Madeline Miller, I think her name is. Song of Achilles, which is breathtaking, and Circe, which is breathtaking. And Emily Wilson wrote just this amazing translation of the Odyssey, and this is Maria Headley who translated this version of Beowulf. So here's just some things they talk about in like an hour. Really interesting reflection on not only Grendel's mother's vengeance, but her very real sorrow. Her monstrosity in other translations is just so front and center that her sorrow, which is in the original, is so muted that it might as well not even be there. Really interesting. Secondly, the poem's strange and under-discussed humor, not only the Unferth Beowulf banter, but Headley has some interesting things to say. Also, some interesting notes on how not to be overwhelmed by by epic poetry's digressions, which there are plenty of those in the Odyssey. And obviously, as we know, there's plenty in Beowulf. So that's a really great teaching note. I love this. The word that, Grendel's mother has fingers. In fact, it's a cognate. It's almost the same word in Anglo-Saxon. But various male translators have translated it claws. And Headley says, any woman who's just had her nails done would probably have a really hard time wielding a weapon, which is kind of a funny interchange in the podcast. But also there's a interpretive choice there that if Grendel's mother has human fingers, she's now a different character than a monstrous creature with claws. So it's interesting. Really interesting chatter about which characters are silenced and why does it matter. And then the thing, these two have kind of gone on the road a lot, is like the two prominent women with recently published translations of traditionally male texts. So they're both sort of strongly desired speakers. I'm hoping, I'd love to meet them. They're asked all the time, are these female translations of a poem? Emily Wilson, who translated the Odyssey, is currently writing a book on a philosophy of translation, which I'm excited to read. And then this dude is worth following. He's funny. He's at Middle Tennessee State University, super passionate medievalist. He teaches a Tolkien, J.K. Rowling class. All of his lectures are on YouTube every year. So this is as close to like a complete set of Beowulf lectures as I could find, but other years the line differences are, the lines are different. He has some good Shakespeare stuff too, but I think his medieval stuff is really great. Super clear, super loud, super passionate. It's not a matter of whether you agree with him. But just, if you're a person who doesn't have the money or the time to go to college, but you want to know what it's like to sit in one of these classes, to study with someone who's thought about this deeply, it's really good of him to sort of publicize all these things. And also, if you're doing a research paper on, say, a speech in this section, I would definitely use him as a resource. This book probably is the best book about teaching any text. It's a series called Approaches to Teaching, not super innovative as a title. I have the Bleak House one, the Beloved one, Waiting for Godot, Frankenstein, Pride and Prejudice, Romeo and Juliet. I mean, it's great. The premise is teachers from a variety of contexts write short articles about their strategies teaching, whether it's in Beowulf, there's all different ones. So they include, in the beginning, and I didn't include this here, there's a lot of scholars giving you background, whether it's archaeology, linguistics, theology, history, military stuff. But in terms of the pedagogy, there's a piece, Visual Materials for Teaching Beowulf, Writing as Instrument for Teaching Beowulf, Women in Beowulf, Teaching Beowulf as Performance. Check out the series. I would, in any core text of your school or any text that you maybe struggle teaching, get your library to get the Approaches to Teaching volume for that text. It is just incredibly liberating to find out what 10 different people do. And some in the series, you'll have like, I remember someone at a military college, I think, was teaching, Pride and Prejudice. And I remember someone in a prison doing Paradise Lost. And so it's really interesting, the kinds of teaching that are going on. This is one of 2 really, really well-known anthologies of Beowulf criticism. These are all available. Interpretations of Beowulf. Again, not a great title, but anyway. The articles that stand out to me, Weird and Providence in Anglo-Saxon Thought. So a pagan idea of something like fate and then God's will, how those 2 things live together in Anglo-Saxon thought. It's actually really interesting. Margaret Goldsmith's Christian Perspective in Beowulf. John Lairl's Interlaced Structure of Beowulf, where his thesis basically is there are no digressions in the poem. Anything that's a long digression is actually part of the poem. I discussed that in a previous video. Then another article I discussed earlier, Grendel's Mother as Epic Antitype of the Virgin and Queen. This is the article, the anthology of criticism that my Beowulf teacher in graduate school, Mark Scowcroft, had us buy. And it's sort of the standard one. And it features, the article on Beowulf that was published, if I remember correctly, in 1936, Beowulf, the Monsters and the Critics, by Tolkien himself. And before that, Beowulf was sort of considered a historical artifact. It was an interesting thing to read if you wanted to know how things were back then, but it wasn't considered a serious work of literature in its own right. Its aesthetic considerations weren't really taken seriously, and Tolkien changed that forever in 1936. So if you see this in the bookstore, if you see Beowulf in the bookstore or are asked to read it or are curious about it, it's really Tolkien you have to thank. No joke. If you're interested in if you're doing some research with students and you have a student who wants to focus on the exciting plot points, H.L. Rogers' Beowulf's 3 Great Fights is a really good point. And then if you have anybody interested in archaeology, Sutton Hoo and Beowulf by C.L. Wren, and then Caskey's Sapientia and Fortitudino, which is Wisdom and Strength, as the controlling theme of Beowulf. And I just want to say, these are really hard. So if ever I share, I never share entire articles with my students. We don't do a research paper on Beowulf. I do that with other things, but I sometimes share little sentences that these people write because they think very boldly about what they read, and that's what teachers want their students to do. So obviously, Tolkien thought his whole life about Beowulf, whereas my students think for a few weeks about Beowulf. But, they make amazing connections, and, it's sort of like if you're growing up and you're playing baseball, you do go to professional baseball games to get inspired, and it's not, going to hopefully discourage you. It's good to see professionals do professional things. And that's why I share these with students. Oxford has a few podcasts about Beowulf, specifically the 2 that I liked. One is called Desiring Dragons, Creative and Critical Responses to the Dragon in Beowulf. And then What Tolkien Learned from Beowulf, Representations of Evil. Any of these you can Google. It's super easy to find. And last but not least, Tolkien himself, his son Christopher, who's now either dead or pretty old, definitely one or the other, in his 90s, I think, published Tolkien's translation of Beowulf, which is hard to read. It's pretty antiquated sounding because it's old, right? But the jewel of this book are his notes. It's almost like getting, the smartest kid in the class's class notes. And they're scattered and disorganized, but they're just incredibly deep, meditations on often individual words. He has several paragraphs on the Anglo-Saxon word weird, W-Y-R-D, which is always translated to fate. And he just says that's a bad translation. Fate gives you a sense that there's a controlling principle determining things, like the Fates in ancient Greece, who were women, right? he says that a better translation for a weird is simply what happens, and that's more authentically of the spirit of the word. Anyway, this is worth owning. And again, the translation is what it is, but the notes, which are most of the book, are breathtaking. I really hope this helps. Feel free to reach out in the comments section in YouTube. I'd like to hear how you're doing with either reading the poem or teaching it. I do not claim to be an expert, have all the answers. I just really like thinking about these things, and I hope you do too. Stay in touch, and good luck with your reading.